And so I want to talk about some lessons from other things and look at them with regards to programming. I find that people that have other hobbies bring so much back to our field. People that do woodworking come back with a different uh, attitude towards programming. So let's start out with what it takes to be cooking well and what I might know from a reliable source. And so I've gone to the experts that I know and researched this and thought about, well, what does it take to be a chef? And so this is our main character from the movie. And you look at him and think, well, what does it take? Is it the hat? I don't think so. Maybe it's the rat underneath. And if you think about the Ratatouille School of Management, it's really not the way to create a great chef. The way to create a great chef is not to have someone in your hair pulling you one way or another. It's also not the way to create great developers. So what is the way that we should treat our developers? Well, you think about cooking, and sometimes you start from a recipe, and home cooks do something different than restaurant cooks. Home cooks, it's 5 o'clock, it's 6 o'clock, and you think to yourself, I'm hungry. And so you start right then and think, maybe I'll cook dinner. So you look online and you find yourself a recipe, and you think you have the ingredients. You might as well get started. You go to the stove, you put a pan on the stove, you put oil in the pan, you turn it on, you get it heated, you stop chopping up some garlic, you throw that in the pan, you go to the refrigerator looking for onions, and they're here somewhere. I know they're here somewhere. Uh-oh, I'm making something that I don't have all the ingredients for. The garlic is burning. I go back to the stove and I'm in the weeds. And my kitchen smells like this and the smoke detector's going off. Now, in restaurant cooking, it's a little bit different. In restaurant cooking, you think dinner service is coming up in about 6 hours. And you think, oh, I just don't have enough time to get ready 6 hours away, because you don't even think of going to the stove in restaurant cooking until you have what you need. And so this might be what's sitting in front of your station. You've got all the ingredients, you've got the things to put on, and you know that this dish takes this and that, and you understand every step, you know what's involved, you know the timing, you have everything you need before you go to the stove. Now, we can do this at home. You know, I do this type of cooking at home, and before I go to the stove, I get everything together. And this is the put in place, this is the thing that we call in the title of the talk, the mise en place. And so as a developer, what is your mise en place? Well, maybe it's the libraries you use. Maybe it's the language, maybe it's the framework, maybe it's Xcode or whatever tools that you use. It certainly is your team. You undervalue sometimes the people around you, and it's you and your experience. It's that idea of what you're building. So you go to the stove with a recipe, that's one thing, but how do you develop the recipes in the first place? And as an example, I want to look at bread. Your basic bread has 4 ingredients. That's it: flour, water, salt, and yeast. But the parameters within each of these choices allows you to make very different kinds of bread. So what kind of bread do I want to make? Well, it might depend on what kind of flour I use. I might use all-purpose or bread or whole wheat. Yeast might be fresh or instant or sourdough. There are other ingredients I can add, sweeteners, I can add eggs, I can add milk. But the basic 4 ingredients, flour, water, salt, and yeast, and one of the fundamental things that we use, not when you're a home cook first learning to make bread, but as you get better, as you start looking at how people who bake bread for a living bake, they start looking at the hydration. What percentage of water? And this percentage of water is usually a percent of the flour weight. And so when we say a baguette is 68% water, what we mean is if we use 1,000 grams of flour, then we use 680 grams of water. And a ciabatta, on the other hand, might be 80% of water. Think about the things that you are building your tools out of, that you're building your apps out of, and it's a lot of the parameters here, a lot of the different choices. The yeast might be fresh yeast, but you might have also chosen to use a sourdough instead, or a pre-ferment. You might use a biga or a poolish instead. And so there's all these things that you can bring to your table. How you mix it. Do you mix it all at once? Do you add things later? So there's the autolyse method. These 4 ingredients, so many options. so many things that you're expected as an expert to bring. So you start with a plan, you explore, you revise, you're developing your recipe, you're thinking, is this what I'm trying to make today? And then you make sure you can replicate it. It's no good if I can only do it once. You know, you press that button and it works once, and so you ship it. I mean, there's no errors. It's only a warning. I can ship this. And then you scale it for production, because just because I can do it at home doesn't mean that I should check it into the project I'm working on, where if you think of the projects that some people are working on online and how many times these apps get hit, you got to make sure that it scales for production. You know, it worked with one network call. Yeah, good luck with that. So you revise it some more, and now you know what to prep. You know what goes into this recipe. You know how to scale it from just making it one time and making sure it tastes good. Now you know all the ingredients you need to have assembled. You know how to use it. And so here's an example from UI. And I've been playing a lot with SwiftUI over the past year. And here's an example from a course I do where it's a nice rock, paper, scissors app. And here we do with SwiftUI. And here is my position view. This is between the image of rock, paper, scissors and the title of whose turn it is. And so I look at this and I think I need more space in between that icon and that word. And one thing I could do is I could just start throwing numbers in and start spacing it that way. And I could just guess what the space is. And that's certainly okay. But imagine that I instrumented this so I could sit down with the designer and they could say, no, that's exactly how much I want. And so imagine I could put a slider in there and you could move the slider and it would change the space and the designer could say, there, that much. And we can do that very easily in SwiftUI. We can bind to a slider value. And so as you move the slider, it changes the value. And we can set the spacing in the VStack to be that slider value. And now, as I bring my designer in, they can move it and they can look for the value they want. And they could say, there, that's the value I want. And now you go back and you can code it in. And so you've experimented, you developed your recipe. Maybe you want to scale it by looking at it on different devices. Maybe you want to do it in different orientations. But as a first experiment, SwiftUI allows us to play very easily. Now I can hard code that as being 20 because that's what my designer said. And while they're there, maybe we want to use that same slider and maybe instrument a border. And so maybe we set the slider value to be representing the border. And so now when they adjust the slider, they see a border around there and they go, there, that's how much border I want. And whatever number they choose, we code that in. And now we say, well, we're here with our slider. Why don't we apply the slider value to the opacity? I didn't like the black. Maybe I'll go to a secondary color, test this in dark mode and light mode. And now we go ahead and experiment with our slider and we can test for the color. And I found that I wanted opacity of 40. So we started with a plan. We explored, we experimented, we revised, we worked with other people, we made sure we could replicate, we scaled it for production. And once we had it nailed down, we decided that we wanted to capture all the things that we did in a view modifier. And now everybody on my team can use the same design that my designer decided was right for our app. And so we do this in the kitchen, we do this in our code. And now we're ready for service. Okay, more restaurant cooking. You guys doing okay? Like you can talk back to me. So there's a lot of repetition in a restaurant. You want to make sure that when you have a dish, you can prepare it the same way so the customer comes back for their favorite dish. They aren't disappointed. And you can build it and I can build it. So that's what we did with our view modifier. We built that recipe that we could use to create more than one great dish. Now, this is hard for us. We don't like doing the repetition. We love to build tools. We love to think, I don't know if I'm ever going to need it, I feel like building this today. I want to learn Combine. I'm going to do something with Combine. You don't need it. I don't care. So I want you to focus on the goal. I recently talked to a developer friend of mine, and he wants to write a book, but he's a developer. What kind of book does he want to write? Maybe a book about programming, maybe Swift. No, no, no. He thought maybe functional programming. Oh, you know what's selling now? Books about Combine. And in the midst of all this, he said, wait a minute, before I write my book, I want to write an app that helps me write my book. I don't like using any of the tools that are out there. And so he did. And many months went by, and his book hadn't even begun because he's still trying to write, I don't know, text edit, BB edit, something that he has already in his hands. And finally, he realizes he's not writing his book and decides, I'll just use the tool that I have. So focus on your goal. If you're writing the tools to write the book, that's great. We often do that. Before we write an app, we write the language that our app is going to be in. We create our model. We create our enums that we're going to use. But if you're writing the tools instead of writing the book, that's a problem. And I know you're sitting there thinking, yeah. So I had the same problem. Instead of using Keynote, I thought, I have a very distinctive way of writing my code. I'm tired of cutting and pasting and styling. And so I would write my own app to display code in a slide. And so step one was parse Markdown. Now, it turns out parsing Markdown for code is non-trivial. And the reason is most parsers place the code in a pre. And so you can't style inside. And so the kind of code that I wanted was I would highlight the code that we're talking about on this slide. And I put comments in gray, and I'd be able to focus you on the thing that I'm talking about. And so I thought, okay, I have to write my own parser. So I started looking at parsers, and I got deep, and I really started to understand the state monad. So that was a plus, but I wanted to display code. And then I decided, well, John Sundell has ink, and he allows us to have hooks into it so that we can do some styling. And so I thought, I'll do that. Now I've parsed my stuff that I want. I need to render it. Now, here's the style I use for my code. I tend to use this blue color in my books and my slides. And then I draw your attention to what I'm talking about by making it red. And maybe I have a comment or delete something. I want to draw your attention to the things I'm talking about. And so I needed to write this parser and use ink and write my EPUBs, and I wanted to generate HTML. So I started with a text view and a web view. And then I decided to go full SwiftUI, and it was beautiful. I can type in input and my app will generate output. And so I'll show you what it looks like. Now, I don't type so quickly, but as I type, you can see below there, it's rendered in the blue. And I was so happy with that. So I thought, well, what if I want to do a comment? I'll put that between asterisks. And you see, as I close off my asterisk, it'll style it in gray. Feeling really good. So what about two asterisks? Two asterisks, maybe that'll be the highlighted code. And it's in real time. As I type each character, I'm seeing the results below. As I finish my asterisks, it's going ahead and wrapping it up. If I want to show deleted code, I could use these two little squiggles and now close that off, and it's closed off. And I was so happy. It worked so beautifully. And then I paused and thought, that's one code. I still haven't written my whole slide app. Ugh. So, of course, I'm just using Keynote today. In general, if you're writing the tools to support your project, that's great. If you're writing the tools because that's easier than addressing your project, don't. It's so easy to get lost in the process. I want you to focus on your goal. Now, sometimes the other stuff is important too. So I don't feel bad about what I did because I learned about the state monad in a deep way. I explored SwiftUI in a deep way. But sometimes all you want to do is display code on the screen. So I'm in Cleveland. It gets cold in the winter, and I decided I'd like to grow plants indoors. That's my entire goal. So I want to take these plants and I want to cook with them, but I don't care about hydroponics or whatever. I just want to grow plants and use them in my cooking. That's it. So I asked people online, what do you use? What do you like? I got recommendations. I looked for a minute and thought, maybe I could build this myself, but no, I'm not very handy. So I waited for a sale and I bought one. And here it is. It's just basically a reservoir of water. There's a pump underneath and there's a light and there are timers. And I got to tell you, this is how non-handy I am. This isn't even a picture of mine. This is a picture of the website. And you can tell that because you can see the little forward and back arrow. So I'm not even going to hide that. The basil went crazy. I made a ton of dishes from the basil. The lettuce went nuts. I had great salads. That's all I wanted from it. Now, one of the really nice things about having my daughter home for the pandemic is that she's been introducing me to some shows on YouTube that I never would have found. And one of them is June's Kitchen. And June decided to grow plants indoors as well. Now, June goes overboard, but for him, the process is part of it. And he's producing these beautiful videos. So if you've ever seen June, you know he didn't just go and buy an Aero garden and plug it in. The first thing he did was he put his cat into a basket and went on a bike ride. And he biked into the woods and he looked for sticks. Now, his goal is hydroponics. He went to the hardware store and he bought wood and he started building the frame for the thing that he's building. He took the sticks that he found in the woods and he boiled them in water so that they would be something he could use in an aquarium. And he glued them together and he got some moss and he started covering them in moss and he built little bonsai trees to go inside of the aquarium. This is what he's using for the water reservoir. He hasn't even gotten to the hydroponic part. This is the thing that is just a bucket of water, but it's stunning. It's going to live below his plants. Where are the plants? He'll get there. It's in the last 2 minutes of his 20-minute video. Here's the hydroponics. It's a little pump and a little sponge at top, and you can see the plants growing in it. And if you look at his finished project, which is stunning, it's the aquarium underneath. It's plants that have been raised and taken out of the garden on top. And the only thing that I was concerned with was this piece here. But for him, I can get lost in the process. He had a bigger goal. Sometimes the process, learning the state monad, sometimes that is part of what's important. And sometimes the process creates what's important. Back with my code parser, this is what I got to show people. But along the way, as I started working with it, I created a nice enumeration with all those types that I could display. I had none, and I had my strong, and I had my deleted, and my comment. I had all these things along the way. And now here's how I use that. I started with a multi-line string. I started pulling things out as I parsed it. I replaced a new line character with something that I could split on and then later put back in. And so I've got this character that I take out so I can put back in so I can get my multi-line string that I'm going to display. And that was inside of a build block function. And that was inside of a result builder. If you're building this today, still use underscore and function builder. This hasn't been checked in yet. But this was my goal. My goal was to learn more about function builders. My goal was to figure out what was going on here. So the code parser was nice, but honestly, what I wanted to learn was how do you use these result builders? And here's how I use it. It's something that takes a function. Oh, all that time spent on functional programming is paying off. This takes a trailing closure. And so when I actually use it in my code, when I call it from the main view, there's where I use Sundell's Inc. to parse the code. I wrap that in a package I wrote. I take the input that you saw at the top of the screen before, that's the text editor, and what I display it in is this output, this code view. Look at how simple and beautiful that code is because it uses a result builder. That thing there is a result builder that I'm creating with a trailing closure. And so the process for me became part of what's important. I didn't lose myself in it. I wanted to learn more about parsing. I did it. I wanted to learn more about SwiftUI. Did that too. Wanted to learn more about functional programming. Check. I'd heard about Sundell's Inc. on his podcast. I wanted to learn about that. Took care of that. The Swift Package Manager is something that I've been meaning to come to for a long time, and now I've been creating my own packages because of this project, so check. And finally, I really wanted to learn about result builders. And in the end, I don't have something I can use to produce my slides. I'm okay with that. In this case, it's June's Kitchen. In this case, the journey was my goal. So we know what happens when life gives you lemons, but what happens when life doesn't give you lemons? You're sitting there with a recipe that calls for lemons and you don't have any. You need to stop and think, what were the lemons there to accomplish? What in your recipe, what was the role that the lemons were supposed to play? If it's flavor, you think, well, what can I use instead of lemons that can contribute to the flavor? Maybe another citrus, maybe about taking it in another direction. Maybe you're going to use something spicy that contributes in that way, that it's cutting through the fat that way. Maybe instead of taste, maybe the lemon was there for acidity. Well, if it was acidity, maybe I can replace it with vinegar. So you're not just sitting there with a recipe because someone told you to use URL session, that's what you're using. You're there thinking, well, what if that's not working for me in this case? You are a professional. You're someone who's there not just to replicate, or you could be replaced. You're there because you're smart. You can draw analogies. You have examples. You've worked with something like arrays for a long time. You've worked with result type. And so because you've worked with these combinators, map and flat map for arrays and result type, when Apple releases combine, you have a metaphor in your head. You have a framework to understand these things. And so you've done things like this with two arrays. You've zipped them together, dropped the first thing, and used a map on them. And so when Apple says we have combine, you can apply this metaphor that you know, you can apply this picture that you have in your head and use combine in the same way. Maybe there are differences. You're taking things that come to you in a stream. Maybe you don't use it in exactly the same way you used it for arrays, but you have the right framework for it. And when you have to add something that is particular to combine, you see the new things in the context of the things that you know. Maybe you start with an array and you drop the first, and then you use a key path to map it. It might be exactly the same thing. Instead of starting with an array, I start with a publisher. And my combinator, the same way it reached inside of an array, transformed it and put it back inside of an array, my operators in combine reach inside of the publisher, pull out the values that I want, modify them in some way, put them back inside a publisher, and pass them on. And so I'm doing the same things that I've done before, but I'm doing it in a new context. I don't have lemons right now. What do I have in my refrigerator? What can I do? When you're out of lemons, you're the star of Chopped. You can still make salad dressing. Look for what else you have. How do we teach someone they can do this? How do you become a great chef? We've already seen it's not the hat. We've already seen it's not the rat. It's repetition with guidance. You're focusing on a goal. You're learning, you're acquiring skills, you're watching the people around you, you're asking people. Oh my gosh, having the strength in yourself to say, if I ask for help, it doesn't mean I'm stupid. It means I'm smart. I'm trying something. Dick Gabriel, who's been around forever, had this idea of an MFA in computer science. He thought that treating it as a science might not be the right approach always. And so he thought he was uniquely positioned because he had a PhD in computer science and he also had an MFA in writing poetry. And he thought, what is it you do when you're teaching fine arts that we don't do in computer science? And so, for example, what if you're going to learn to be a great artist? On day one, Gabriel says, you sketch something. Now, this was a specific program at RISD. And so, for instance, look at my fine sketch of my chef with his rat. But the thing that differs in an MFA program is you sketch it again. And every day you go back and you sketch the same subject. So for instance, you go down to the same spot in the same river bed and you sketch the river with the trees behind it. And every day you sketch it again. Each day you see different things. Each day you try different things. Maybe today I'll try it in charcoal. Maybe tomorrow watercolor. Maybe the trees aren't so important to me today. I'll focus on something else. When you do something with that kind of repetition, what you do isn't precious. Your drawings don't mean something to you because they are the means to you learning, to becoming something. You don't defend them. When a colleague says, but why did you use a for loop there? You should have done this. It's not personal. It's not yours because tomorrow you'll write some more code. A line cook makes that same dish every day. It's not always exactly the same. It can be a little bit different, but they don't get precious about it. They're going to make that dish 8 more times tonight, 80 more times this week. So back to bread. When I learned to make bread, I learned from cookbooks, and then I had the luck to go to a class. And the luck of going to a class was I got to touch a lot of bread. And you make this bread that's 70% hydration. And so what does that mean? You start with 400 grams of flour. I use this much water. Got it? So that's 280 grams of water. Now, this would be a recipe, but bakers think of this as a formula. It's a formula where you're going to adjust parameters. You're going to get your hands in that dough and you're going to feel it and say, it doesn't feel wet enough today. I need to touch that dough and decide it needs more water today, or it means less water today. It needs something. I need to change it in some way. Maybe I need to mix it longer or more aggressively. And Gabriel says we don't do that as developers. We learn to make a linked list once and we're done. Nobody in school says, great, you got that problem right. Now go home and do it a different way. Learn 8 different ways to approach that. You know, you think of that with Swift. In Swift, we know that optionals are implemented using an enum. And so in our heads, that's what an optional is. It has 2 cases. It has none and it has some. But there are other ways of implementing optionals. We could implement optionals with an array that contains 0 or 1 element. And when you consider how else you can do it and you try it, maybe you'll come back to doing it with enums. But when you come back to doing it with enums, you're coming back to it for a reason. You decided after looking at many options, that was a great way to do it. You didn't do it because it was the only thing you knew how to do. So mise en place means putting yourself in place too, getting yourself trained and learning and constantly coming to conferences like this and talking to people and learning new things. So before you write your app, you write the language that you're going to write your app in, but you focus on the goal. Your goal is writing the app. You start with a plan, you explore, you revise, you replicate, you scale it for production, you revise it some more, and you learn constantly. And you make sure that you stay flexible, that you're not defending things. You put everything in your place. Everything's in its place, even you. And now you have this in front of you. Look at those tools. And not only that, but you can combine them. When you multiply all the different ways that you can combine these things into a dish, sure, some will be disgusting. Don't do those again, but play. You are the chef. And it turns out you are also the rat. You're the one controlling both. So go to the stove. Thank you.